Hey everyone, another recitation here on APIs, how we interact with them, but I also want to show a bit about how I would organize this project in order to try to use the APIs to work for us, rather than having to do the manual state management that I have now. Cover a little bit more about where I like to, organize my API requests and how we can design around endpoints that don't actually exist yet, which is a pretty neat trick. And then whatever else you'd like to see. If I have time, I might touch on authentication, but I'm guessing that will be tomorrow. So the current problem that I have here is when I add a person, it works, but when they show up here, this is actually a result of me doing some manual state management. Because when I add the person, or wait, I thought I removed doing all of this. Yes. So when I add the person, then what I'm doing is I'm calling set people, and I'm adding the person to my array of people. Now there's nothing wrong with this. This is actually pretty good because when we make our request to the API to add the person, we get the person back, we then set people, and that's actually pretty good. We're not making any additional requests. We're not going back and getting the whole list of people. So that's fine. But when we edit the person, our code gets kind of complicated surrounding that. We have to do these weird things. So what I want to do if I am, trying to get my project up and running as fast as possible, I don't want to have to worry about manually managing my state for this. This is an optimization. I should be able to leverage my API in a way that I can just get the updated state from my server and not have to worry about managing it myself. And we can do that with our use effects. The way this is set up is whenever the component is first rendered, we'll go and get the team members, and then we'll put that into our data. The problem is what we mean by first render. So that means when the component is mounted and rendered for the first time. So let me go to my form, and I'm going to add a use effect in here so we can see what we mean. So in my form component, I'm adding a use effect, and all I'm going to do is inside the use effect callback, I'm going to console.log first render. And I'm going to have this run with an empty dependency array. So what we know is that means it should only run once when our component is first rendered. And let's navigate to our form by clicking on add person, and we see this first render showing up like we expect. Now let me go back home. First render pops up again. So that might be unexpected because when we say it runs on the first render, we don't mean the first time this thing is ever rendered and then never again. Because the way React works is when we navigate to this add page, the form doesn't exist yet. It has to create that component, put it in the virtual DOM, and put it in the real DOM. We call that mounting. And then when I navigate back to home, it deconstructs that form component. It gets rid of it. It deletes it. And now when we go back, it has to entirely reconstruct it again. Whereas when I'm on here and I change the data, we don't see first render again because it's that same form component. We're just updating the data it has. But when we navigate to home, we're deleting it. We don't have object permanence. Once we route back to home, that form component, that instance of it ceases to exist. So when I click add person, we're creating a new instance of this form component. And so we get that first render. We can use that to exploit the functionality that we have set up on home of when it is first rendered. Here we're going to get those team members. So if I set up my app correctly using components and routes, then I can have it so that when I add this person, I don't really care what the API sends back to me, because I'm just going to navigate back home, and when we do that, it's going to go and get all of the new data again. Now, is that a robust and technically correct solution? Probably not, because it's wasteful in terms of making extra requests for data that we don't necessarily need, but this kind of shows the power of working with APIs and not having to manually manage all of this state ourselves, which is good if we're trying to build an MVP. If we're trying to get the features in front of our users as fast as possible, they don't really care if we're making extra requests to our API. We should be aware of the better solution, the more efficient solution, all of these things, but we're paid to deliver to users. They care about the features our product offers, not how clean and efficient our code is. It's going to be important later, but if our stated goal is to hit an MVP, then we want to do that as fast as possible, and this is how we're going to do that. So, with that out of the way, let's actually try to implement this. If we take a look at my app, let me remove some of the extraneous comments that I have here. So what we have is routing set up for home, for add, and for edit, and then also for rendering the cards. But we're actually performing getting these team members directly inside of our app. So what that means is app is mounted once. App is mounted when we first render the entire app. If I put a console log first app render in here, we'll see that only ever fires once at the very beginning. And even though I'm navigating to other pages, we're never getting rid of the app component. We're never deleting it and re-instancing it, because it's what everything else is contained inside of. So we want to put this in its own component that we're rendering inside of this path, so that way when we navigate here, we're actually getting rid of it and then popping it back into existence, and we'll get that behavior for free. And I'm going to do this using the organizational layout that I like. So I'm going to take a look at my file structures. Right now I have my app in this components thing. I don't really like this. What I prefer is to make a folder called views or scenes. And this is going to contain my components that represent entire pages. Because normally we try to write our components with kind of a one-purpose, reusable mentality, but that's only so useful until we get to the point where it's like, all right, well, I actually need to render a page, and it has a bunch of stuff on it that's unrelated, and we tend to call those something like views, scenes, pages, something. So I like to put those in a directory called views, and let's see, I'm going to have 3 views. I am going to have home, I am going to have edit, and I'm going to have add. And then inside of here, I am going to make this component. I could do something like add.js. I could absolutely do that. But I can also do index.js. That way, when I import the add directory, when I import this add directory, it will automatically go out and get what's in the index.js. And I just like that format a little bit better. I think it's a little bit cleaner. So let's go and find what we actually want to render inside of that add. So what we're doing now is on add, we're rendering this form component, and that's about it. So it's totally fine that I still have my form and card inside of these component directories, because that makes them reusable. The way that I like to organize this is from the Medium article that I posted yesterday, which I'll show, which is that if I'm using components in multiple views, they go out here in this components directory. But if I'm writing a component that's only used in one place, then I'll just create a component directory inside of that view so that I've localized this. I don't have a components directory at my source level that's just enormous and contains every component that I've written everywhere, even if we only use it in one spot. This allows me to kind of localize those. And we know that I end up reusing the form between add and edit, so it's perfectly fine to have it out here. Whereas this card we only use in one place, and I'll deal with moving that over in just a bit. So I'm going to go into my views, my add, my index.js. I'm going to import React from React. I'm going to declare my add components. And export it. Then I want to import my form. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to import form from // components form.js, and I'm going to want to render my form. I might as well, while I'm here, put this inside of a div, maybe add an h1 that says add person. So we just get a little bit more of a page feel on that. So what I'm going to be doing then is I'm going to be looking inside of my app and seeing what I actually rendered here. So I ended up giving it this submit person function, some button text, and then the props that I'm getting from the route. So let's take a look at this submit person function. Here it requires the information from app, because we're using set people and it has to be aware of this array that's inside of app. But the whole point of me structuring it in this way is that I can get rid of this. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to delete this. I'm just going to put a return there. And I'm just going to pull this into here, because I want to kind of divorce the logic connecting these pages. I'm going to use the API as kind of the remote place where I manage all this state. I'm not going to do it inside of app. I'm also going to need to import my API, which under this organizational scheme is in a folder called services. And I can also declare services at the view level. You know, if I have some extra code that's not a component that I only use in one view, then I can do it within there. So then now I have this this add that takes in props and defines its own function to add a person to the team, is really unaware of the outside world. And I'm going to go ahead and give this form all of the props that I'm getting in add so that it can have access to the match and history objects and do whatever it likes within there. So then inside of here, I am going to import this view, which is really just a component, which is going to be inside of component, or I'm sorry, inside of views and add. And because I did that index.js, I can just import the entire folder here. So now I can go and I can replace this render with my add component. I'm just going to give it a component. for add. So now when I come over here, I get my add person component, and I forgot to give this some button text of add person, and then I also need to give it the submit person function, which I defined right up there. So now we have this ability to make a test person, and when I add that person, we navigate back to home and nothing has appeared to have happened. But if I refresh that page, we will see that we have indeed added this person. So what I'm going to do is I'm also going to componentize my entire home page, so that when we navigate back to here, we're going to remount that component, and it's actually going to go and re-get the data from the server. So let's do that. Inside of home, I'm going to create again index.js. I'm going to import React from React. I'm going to declare our component that takes some props, and I'm going to export that component. And from here, I'm going to try to move the logic that I have inside of my app related to the home page into this view. So if we look here, what we're doing at home is we're rendering all of the person cards. And so I'm also going to want to do that. So let me import my person card. But the only place that I am really using this component is inside of that view. I don't need it in this top level component directory. In fact, it's kind of cluttering this up. What if I want to make other cards? You know, this is non-specific. I might have to rename this to person card later, and you know, I can just make this exactly local to the place it needs to be. So I'm going to move that. So I'm going to do this with the terminal. Oh, I'm going to need to make a new terminal. So I'm going to move card.js up a level, and then into views, and then into home. And it's going to yell at me until I fix this. But I'm going to go into views, I'm going to go into home. Now I'm going to create a directory called components. I don't want to do that. And I'm going to move that into components. So then within here, I can import this card from /components/card.js. And now only this is really aware of that. So we want to then get all of our people and then use that to render those cards. So I'm going to go up here, and I am going to just jack all of this logic. Oh, this is, oh, I need to be an app. So I have this initial people, and then inside of a use effect, let me import these. I am hitting my API and getting those people and saving that into state. I'm also going to need to import my API. And then I'm going to use that to go ahead and render my my list of people. Again, I'll put this inside of a div and add an h1, and call this people. And then inside of here, I will map over all of my people and create the components from them. So now I've turned home into a view, and I can set the component on this route to home. And I'm going to comment out this edit person for the time being. I'm going to import home from /views home. And I'm going to comment out this edit path for now so I don't get errors. Why are we getting an error here? Oh, I'm still trying to import this card that doesn't exist anymore. Alright, so now the way we have this set up is that this, in and of itself, this entire thing is a component. So when I switch over to add person, and then switch back, see how we're getting first app render again? Let me actually change this to be first home render. So now whenever we leave and come back, we're actually running this API request again. So if I go to add person and I just make a new person, we add and it didn't show up. My promise was that it would. But if I refresh, we see that it shows up. And the reason has to do with timing. Some very subtle timing happening here. Which is, let's take a look at our add view. So we're rendering this form. So let's take a look at our form. What we're doing is when we submit the person, we're making this API request, which is masked in this submit person function, and then we're immediately navigating back home. So this API request to add this person has not actually finished when we navigate home. And so this makes this request and then immediately navigates back home, which is going to make another API request, but it's going to return the old list of people. It might actually, if I do it enough times, return the new person in there if the timing works out exactly. But we have to slightly reconfigure how this works. So instead of doing history push inside of my form, I can do it inside of my my add component. And that's good because that makes my form dumber, right? This form now no longer has to be aware of history and worry about navigating away when we submit. So instead, I'm going to do that in my add component. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab history out of props. And I'm going to make my API request to add a person. And then, I don't really care what I get back. I am going to navigate back home. So I've just made my form dumber. And I've also made the timing correct so that as soon as the team member is done being added, then I navigate back home, which is going to make that API request again that should contain the new person. So let's see if that works. Let's go to add person. And there we go. And you actually saw a slight delay. When I hit add person, it didn't immediately navigate back home. There was actually a split second where it cleared the form and it was waiting to get a response back on that request before it navigated back home. And basically what I've done here is this kind of looked like a lot of work, but if you set up your app correctly in the first place, this kind of comes for free. If we talk about what we want to happen when our component is first rendered, then this will happen whenever we navigate back and forth between these routes. So, does anyone have any questions? I kind of did a lot of stuff here. No. No questions because you're all feeling good about that, or no questions because that was a little bit overwhelming? You can unmute yourselves if you want. You know, I want this to be valuable for you all. So,
Overwhelming.
overwhelming?
Yeah.
Okay. So, let's break down what I did here. So, I've written a view, which is just what I'm calling a fancy component that renders out all the stuff that I need for my home page. So let's take a look at that. So what I want is when we go to the home page, I want to get a list of people from my API, and then I want to save it, and then I want to render all of those people into carts. And when I go home, it does exactly that. What I don't want to do is when I add a person to this API, I don't want to have to worry about going and calling set people and adding that person to the array. So what I've done is I've leveraged this use effect to make an API request. And this looks totally fine. What I'm saying is whenever this component is first rendered, I want you to go and get the list of team members and display that on my page. And what's happening is we see whenever I navigate away from this page and navigate back, we see this first home render showing up in our console. And that's because whenever we navigate away from this page, we're essentially removing that home component from our application. We're deleting it for the time being. And in React, we don't have object permanence. So when I navigate back to the home page, React is treating it as if we're making this component again for the first time. So I get this first home render again. So this is actually going out to our API and getting all of this data again every time we flip back and forth. Is this efficient? No. You know, if I don't expect anything to have changed when I do this, I'm just making a lot of extra requests. But this allows us to kind of ignore the difficulties of changing state when we add users. If we have this automatically essentially refresh every time we go back to the page. And we can see this happening. I can, if I want to, inside of this use effect, I'll call set people, and I'll set this equal to an empty array. So what this means is every time we flip back here, you're going to see it flicker for a split second. And I can actually extend this if let's make a set timeout. And let's do our API request in there. And let's only fire that after 2 seconds. Because this might be what the actual user experience is more like when the API is not also running on our computer, so it's effectively instantaneous. So when I go to add person, I'm deconstructing the home component. I'm unmounting it, is what we would call it in the React world. And then when I navigate back to home, there we go. Every time we mount this component, every time we render it for the first time, we're making our API request. So I can use that to my advantage. Because what I do after I add a person is I want to navigate back home. And because I'm doing that, I can exploit the fact that this home component will always go out and get the most updated data from the server. I just need to make sure the timing is right, because I don't want to navigate home until I'm done adding this person. Because if I do it before then when home goes and gets the data from the server, it won't have the new person in there, because that isn't done happening yet. It's going to get the old data. So what I've done is in my add component, I'm saying make the API request to add the person. Then when that request is done, navigate home. So that way, when we navigate home and it makes the request to go and get the team members from the server, it will be doing that where the new team member has been added. So we're going to get that for free. When we add a new person, and I'm also going to add a set timeout in here so that we can see this kind of happening in real time. How do I want to do this? We'll wait 2 seconds again. So now when I add a person, I'm going to click add. We pretend like this request actually takes some amount of time, and then we flip back to our home page. And when we do that, it's going to contain that new person, because we waited until the request finished to actually navigate back to our home page. And by doing that, we're making sure that the server has actually added that person when we go and get the people in our home page. Does that help clear it up at all? Yes. Yes? Okay. Great. And we can use this the same way on edit. So most of the difficulty surrounding getting editing to work was trying to figure out how we could update that person within our state. You know, the other hard part was setting the initial data. The API request makes that easier too. But now, in the way that I've done this, we don't have to worry about that either. Because if we edit the person, and then once that is done finishing on the server, we flip back into home, we'll see that updated data right there. So let's go and also viewitize our edit component, which I kind of already did in the last session. So if I go back to app.js, we'll see that I've already written this like edit form component, which essentially does everything that we need. It goes and it gets that specific person's data from the API. It displays a loading page if the person hasn't been loaded yet, and then it renders the form with all of the appropriate stuff. Before we do that, you know, I'll leave my set timeouts in for now. I'll make sure to remove those before I push the code. And then, let's see, we'll go into edit. I'm going to make an index.js. I'm going to import React from React. I'm going to declare my component that takes in props. I'm going to export this component. All right. So I'm really just going to pull this all in. I didn't have to write my return either. So it's kind of yelling at me. I haven't imported everything yet. So I'm going to need to get the form from / components form, right? We're sharing these components between multiple views, so I've written it in the top level component directory. I'm going to need to import useState and useEffect from React. And this is all just kind of housekeeping I have to do because I wrote it poorly in the initial place. When you're approaching these projects for the first time, you should be kind of writing in this style where you've already collected everything that's going to be in its own page, rather than doing it all in app.js. And I'm also going to import my API. Import API from services/API. Okay. And we're going to work through what is going on here. So what I've done is I am declaring an initial person. I am getting that person's data from the API. Then when that's done, I'm saving that data. If I haven't gotten the person from the API yet, then I want to display a div that says loading. Otherwise, if I do have a person, then I want to render my form with it set up to take that initial person. I have another function I'm giving it when it's submitted, and I'm giving it the button text. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to remove some of what I'm getting out of props here. I'm not going to get edit person as a prop because I'm going to write that right here in edit, and I am also going to define my own button text. So this can just be edit person, and then I'm going to need to write my edit person function, which I can largely just steal out of app. So what I'm doing in here is I am sending the new data that I want to be contained in my person to the server. And then when that's done, previously I had to figure out how to go and update that in my stored state. But I don't care about that now, because when I navigate back to the home page, it's going to go ahead and get the new updated data anyway. So what I can do is just delete this. And just like in the add, once this request is finished, once I get the response back and know that this has been successful, then I can navigate back home. And I'm just getting a little error here because history isn't defined. What does that mean? You're going to see this a lot when you work like this. That just means we haven't actually pulled it out of our props yet. I just hadn't defined history. Could I have also done props.history.push? Yes, I could have. I just like destructuring. I just like being able to see at the top of the file everything I'm using out of my props. So let's get this all hooked up, and let me delete some of this old stuff. So here I can just get rid of this render function because I'm just going to render my edit component. And I haven't defined it yet, so I need to go out and do that. I'm going to import edit from /views/edit. And now that error goes away. React must be in scope. Oh, that needed to be a capital React, I think. Cannot resolve. Oh, this needs to be a lowercase React. I just goofed and reversed them. Okay. So when we render our home, we get all of our people. Let's edit me. Let's add my full name in here. And when I click, let's give me a role too. So when I click edit person, it's going to fire off this request. And then when that's done, it's going to navigate back home. And when we get to home, it's going to hit our server for the new data, including whatever we have done inside of this edit. And there we go. There we go. We get that data. And so that's pretty neat. It's pretty neat. Any questions on this? No questions? No questions because it makes sense, or no questions because it was overwhelming?
Can I see your API get team member?
Yes, this is, I wanted to show this next. So all these functions they're just Axios requests that I have kind of abstracted because I want to be able to use my API URL and change it if I need to, and not have to track it down inside of each of my components. And then I can also show you how to mock these API requests, because your backend person is probably still working on setting up these endpoints for you, so you don't have them yet. And largely, you can just use hard-coded data, but then you don't get to work with the promise structure that these Axios requests have. You can't write the logic with the .then. So I'm going to show you how to briefly set up a promise that will fire instantly, but it will work like the Axios request in terms of setting up a .then. So before we move on, I want to briefly touch again on what these different requests are. These are our CRUD requests. So CRUD stands for create, read, update, delete. These are the kind of basic actions we do on a resource. And a resource is what we call these different kinds of endpoints. They all represent like a different entity, a team member, a book, an author, a grade, these kinds of things we can think about physically, these resources, these entities. And generally, the different actions we can take on them is to create a new team member, which we do here, and we do that with a post request. We're posting new data to the server. And the syntax for that is very similar to get. We're giving it the URL that we want to make the request to. But then, as a second argument, we give it the data that we want to send. So I'm just sending out my entire person object, and I'm assuming that the API is set up to handle that. I know it is because I wrote it, but this is where you'll have a conversation with your backend person about what they expect the API to look like, and then if they're very kind to you, they will also provide you with documentation so that you know what each of the endpoints does, what it expects, what it gives you back. So that's posting, that's creating. We also have reading, which is the GET request we're familiar with. Generally, if we get the entire resource, see how this is singular, get team member. If we just get the whole thing, it's going to give us back all of the team members. That's why I wrote this function as the plural, get team members. Because if I just get this whole thing, it's going to be like, all right, here's all those people. In a similar vein, if I want an individual person, just like on the movies assignment, we usually have it laid out so that the endpoint is a resource and then the ID of the person or the movie or whatever. So here, I just wrote a function that takes the ID and it handles plopping that in the URL for me. Just a little bit nicer to abstract that here. So that's reading, both all and singular. We have updating, which works very similar to posting, but instead of posting, we put. When there's existing data on the server that we're modifying, we use a put request. Post is for new, put is for modification. We're putting data where there already exists a slot for it. And we're doing it very similarly. We're combining what we did with the individual get and the post, and that we have to specify the person that we want to change. So we're specifying the ID that we want, that represents the person, and then we're also giving the server the data that we want to change. And again, my endpoint is just set up to take that whole object just like that. Any questions with these different kinds of requests?
I just want to clarify.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got the get team members as named exports, and then you've got the API as a default export. And so when you call them in, you're using input API from API, and then like add team member, you've got those in brackets as named imports
Yeah.
because
So
they're named.
sorry. This was something I did yesterday because let's go to my add view. So I decided to call this function add person. What if I had decided to call it add team member? Uh-oh, suddenly I have a name conflict. If I had tried to import this directly with add team member, it's going to get mad at me because I'm redeclaring a variable with that same name. And so we could fix that by doing as syntax on our import, but I don't necessarily want to do that. So we can use a neat trick where we can keep the named imports around if we want to use it that way. But we can also, in our default export an object that contains all of these. So that way I can use it the same way we use Axios, right? We do axios.get. We're doing API.this. So that allows me to get something akin to what in other languages we'd call namespacing, to put all of my API functions inside of this object, so I don't have to worry about name conflicts. It's not something you have to do. There's also, you can do things like import star as Axios. There are other tricks to manage this, and this will get all the named imports and put them in an object for us, or I'm sorry, API. Put them in an object for us called API. I just wanted to show you other ways that you might see as you're Googling examples for stuff. And what I've done here is actually a cool thing that is just a part of normal JavaScript. If I have a variable called getTeamMembers and I want to put it in an object under a key as the same name of the variables, like getTeamMembers is equal to my getTeamMembers function, I can just put the variable in the object. And JavaScript will know to create a key called getTeamMembers and then add a variable and set its value equal to the variable of the same name. So doing this is literally equivalent to doing this. Just a little bit of shorthand. You'll notice this is the same as our destructuring syntax, but in the other direction. So that's what I'm doing there. But you could absolutely just use named imports and exports. Just wanted to show you a trick. All right. Any other questions with these API requests? Oh, this should be called add person. No? No questions with these? There's one that I haven't showed, which is delete. I'll show you what it looks like. We're done. Instead of making a get request to the person, we make a delete request. And I think I set up my API to delete that. Let's implement that really quickly, because I also want to show you a CSS trick as well. So let's go to home. And then I'm going to add, I'm going to need to do this in card. So I'm going to give this as a prop, a function to delete a person. And this is where we're starting to get into some tricky stuff. So const delete person, and this is going to take in an ID, and then this is going to use my API.delete team member function and give it that ID. So I'm going to give that to my card. And then I'm going to edit my card component which is inside of the view. The way I've structured this, you don't have to do it that way. I want to make it clear. The official position on organizing React projects is to, as Dan Abramoff wisely told us, move files around until it feels right. This is the way that feels right to me. Most likely the big boss will tell you. But right now I'm your big boss. So so now we also have this delete person function we're getting out of props. So I'm just going to add a div delete, and on click, what I want this to do is I want it to call the delete person function. This expects an ID, so I'm going to give it one. Notice I could not do this. Why is this way wrong? Anyone know?
Did you pass it? The delete person?
Yeah, it works. But when if I were to click on this div, what value would delete person receive as an argument?
Person.
Yeah, it wouldn't receive a person. By default, when we have an event handler, like onClick, when it calls this function, it gives it an event. So if we clicked on
You
this,
gotta make that a function.
yeah, it would call delete person and it would give it the event. This is the same as writing it this way. That's not what I want. Delete person expects an ID. So that's why I have to write it this way, with this arrow function that I'm surrounding it with. So I'm making a new function, and I'm saying, all right, when you click on this, I want you to call delete person with this ID. And technically, this is also receiving an event as an argument. I'm just doing nothing with it. But whatever function we give as our event handler, it's going to receive an event as an argument. And in this case, I don't care about that event. I want it to do something else. I want it to call my function with the ID of the person that I'm rendering inside of this card. So let's save this, and let's see if this works. So I have delete. Let's delete test person. Oh, I forgot to export delete team member from my API. Let me do that real fast. Okay. So then let me delete test person. I click, and nothing has appeared to happen. Nothing has actually happened. But let me refresh the page. That person's gone. Number 4 is gone. We just go straight from 3 to 5. Does anyone know why? When I click delete, nothing appeared to happen, but when I refreshed the page, that person was gone?
Is it because we didn't add like navigating back home after we deleted someone?
Exactly. Because what I'm doing is I'm relying on the fact that whenever I go to this home component, it's going to get the new data. When I click on delete here, it goes and it makes a request to the server and it deletes that person. But I'm doing nothing that says go get the updated data without that person in it. If I were to navigate away and navigate back, we run that request again. And we're going to see that that person is now gone. So there's multiple ways of handling this. I could go and I could do my own state management, and I could, filter the array and remove that person or use whatever method I wanted to pop them out of there. Or I can trigger another request. And this is where we start to see kind of the pain of managing our state this way. It's good up until it isn't. And we'll start to see in the advanced React unit some methods we've come up with to kind of ease this type of state management, where I might, trigger something and I need it to really go and change the state somewhere else, but I don't really want to have my card worry about the state management of this page, and it's like, and there are different tools that the React community has developed to handle state in a way that makes this process a bit easier, namely Redux and other tools like it. But we can fix this. We can fix this without doing the manual state management ourselves. Again, this is not the best way to do this, but it's a way to get it working. So what do I want? I want, after I've deleted the person, I want to go and get my updated data. And up until now, we've been relying on this use effect triggering to make that happen. What I can do is, let me get rid of this set timeout. I don't think we really need it anymore. What I can do is I can put this into, I also don't need this. I can put this into its own function. So I'm just defining a function called update people. And all it does is it hits our API and then sets the people object to be the updated data. And inside my use effect, I'm going to call that. All I've really done is moved my logic from my use effect into its own function. But what this lets me do is when my delete request is finished, I can update my people. So now, instead of just using the implicit reality of navigating back to this page, I can explicitly say, once I'm done deleting, actually perform this request again. And I should call that, probably. And that'll work. Now, when I click delete, it's going to send that delete request to the server. The server's going to respond back saying, great, I did it. Then I'm going to go to the server, ask for all of the people, get that back, and it's no longer going to contain the person I deleted. Is this the most efficient? No. Because I know what's supposed to have happened. I know I could have just deleted that, person out of my state. But this is how we do that, by leaning very heavily on our API. Any questions with that? Alright, while you all think of questions, I'm going to show you my CSS trick, which is how to get an X in the top right corner of a card. So I'm going to give this a class name of card. And I'm going to make this a span instead of a div. And I'm going to give it a class of delete. Class name. I'm going to format this a little bit nicer. And if you do ampersand times colon, that's the HTML code for a nice X. That's not like a lowercase x, but it's like a nicely vertically centered multiplication x. And I want to put that in the top right of my card. So let me give this card some CSS. I'm going to import card.scss, and it's going to yell at me because that doesn't exist. So let me go here and create that file, card.scss, and I'm going to target my card. I'm going to give this, let's say, a max width of 500 pixels. I'm going to give it a border. 1 pixel solid, 1A, 1A, 1A. Give it a border radius of 5 pixels. I'll give it margin 0 auto, and let's just give it some interior padding of 10 pixels. I don't have Node Sass installed. Let me do that real fast. yarn add Node Sass. So that should look decent. And then I want to grab my delete span. So what I want to do is I want to position it in the top right of this card. And the way we can do that is with absolute positioning. We've hopefully used absolute positioning somewhere before, which allows us to use like essentially X and Y values to say exactly where on the page we want this to appear. Hey, there we go. So I want this to show up here. But if we just put position absolute on this delete thing, and then say I want it the top to be like, 5 pixels down and the right to be like 5 pixels over, they all just fly up into the top right corner, which is hidden on the recording, so I'll show it. They all just fly up here. That's not what I want. I want them positioned relative to these boxes. So we set on these boxes position relative. Because what position absolute is actually doing is it's searching upwards to try to find the thing set position relative and then doing its position relative to that. So now when I save this, they'll all appear in this top corner. And I probably want to make this like 10 pixels. And let's do font size of, no, it's very small. That's very big. That's a little bit better. Let's do 6. Alright, and then top, I'm going to make this like 5 again. There we go. And let's do a hover selector. So ampersand represents the current component, and then I'm using the hover selector. Let's set color to be red. So now when we hover over these, it's red. And I can also use my CSS animations. So I want to set a transition time of 0.3 seconds whenever the color changes. So now when I hover over these, I just get the color fading in and out. I also want to set the cursor to be a pointer. You know how when we hover over the links, our cursor turns into a little finger? Well, I want it to do that on this too. And we can just say cursor is pointer. Now when I hover over these X's, I get the pointer. Pretty neat. Just a little bit of CSS. I don't know. You may already know how to do this, but I like doing stuff like this. I think it's fun. And I can click. That pops right out. Look at that. It's starting to look like a real app. Kind of. Alright. Any questions with this? I want to fix this warning I'm getting. Each child in the list should have a unique key prop. That means somewhere I'm using a map and I'm not setting key props, which I did. If I go into my home, I'm creating all of these cards and I'm not giving them keys. Luckily, I know each person object has an ID that is guaranteed to be unique. So usually fixing this error is as simple as that. I'm also getting these warnings in my app that I'm importing a bunch of stuff that's never being used. So I can get rid of that. I'm not using form. I'm not using Axios or API. And I'm not using this function anymore. Inside of form, I'm not using history, so I don't need to define that anymore. It's good to just kind of clear out any of these warnings that you're seeing before you create a merge request, or I'm sorry, a pull request for your project. You don't want to put your app into production where React is straight up telling you, like, hey, you should probably fix this. Just got to delete this line or add a key or whatever. So do things like this before you open your pull requests. Maybe if you're using console logs to debug things before you put it into production, maybe you don't need those console logs anymore. Just little things to think about. All right. I don't want to go too far over this hour. Are there any questions about what we've done today? Interacting with APIs, using CSS.
I sent you a chat. I don't know if you saw it, but it's like, I understand what you're doing. I'm just not sure how to implement it into my own existing code. I keep like messing it up and getting some errors when I try to like implement it myself.
Okay, well, what are the errors you're getting?
I deleted it, so I don't have it right now, but it was like some undefines and like little squiggly lines and stuff like that.
Okay, so literally little squiggly lines generally means that you're using something that isn't declared. So you might be using a function that you haven't imported, or a component you haven't imported, or you didn't, get the values out of props. See how here I always like to destructure my props. So you might be like forgetting to do that for button text, and then if I go down here, mine turns yellow, yours would have a squiggly. There's also a very, very, very common problem in terms of working with these API requests, which is that our data is delayed. When I first pop over to home, there's a split second where my screen is blank. And that's because I don't have any data about my users. So we have to be incredibly careful about what we set the initial value of our data to be. Right here, when I define my people, I'm making this an empty array, because I know later I'm going to try to map over this. If I left this blank, I'm going to get one of the most common errors we see when we start working with APIs, which is people is undefined. And React isn't wrong. People is undefined. Right here, when I leave this empty, this is the same as me writing undefined. So down here, when I do people.map, I'm getting an error because people isn't defined. There's two ways, well, there's kind of three ways of fixing this. And there's obviously infinitely more. The first is that I can check. If people is undefined, which is the same as me just saying not people, then I want to return a div that says loading. So that way, for a split second, I see that loading thing pop up. So I'm not getting this error because this return shortcuts the rest of my function. If people isn't defined, then I never get here when I try to map it. We can also kind of do this inline. I can check and see if people exists first with this AND operator. What AND does is if the left side is true, then it will execute the right side. If the left side is false, it will not execute the right side. And this is because of what logical AND means. AND means that both sides are true. So if the left side is true, then we want to check and see if the right side is true. If the left side is false, we don't have to care what's on the right side because we already know they're both not true. So the AND is already false. This is just basically us writing a ternary operator that has no false statement on it. So if people, people map. If not, people do nothing. So that will also work. The final way of doing this is making sure that the data type that people is initially set to matches what I'm getting back from my API. This works well for arrays, doesn't work as well for objects necessarily. Because map is going to be defined on this empty array, and it's just going to do nothing. So I don't get any errors because it's trying to map on an empty array, and it's like, that's fine, but you know, that doesn't actually mean anything, so we just get an empty array back. So that would be, those would be my two guesses as to why you're getting those errors. You're importing or using things from props that you haven't defined, and your initial data isn't set up to handle what you're trying to do with that data. Even though it will be correct when you get it back from the API, you know, during the first load, you don't have data from your API, so you are getting an error. Does that help?
Yeah, I'm still, like, that makes sense, and I added an empty array, but I'm still kind of confused of where to put it. Like, I made a separate form called data and put my Axios in that, but I think I should be putting it in my form.js within the submit handler.
So this is where it's hard to say, because React is not very opinionated. It doesn't tell you how to organize any of these things. We can make these decisions in almost an infinite number of ways. So generally, I want to keep my state divorced from my reusable components. So in my form component here, it has the state it needs to maintain the form. It has this local state of the person. But this doesn't know about APIs. It just takes in a prop called initial person. And that's going to contain the data from my API when I click edit. It's going to go and get me from the server and give me to this form. And we can see this inside of my edit view. This is where I'm actually making the state that will contain the initial person. This is where I'm getting it from my API and then saving it. And then I'm using the shortcut version here, where I return a loading div until my initial person is set. And then I'm rendering my form and I'm giving it the data that it needs. And there could be a million different bugs, you know, based on the way that you've organized this. And I don't necessarily have a silver bullet for you. You can pop into the help channel Zoom. I would help you live on here, but again, I don't want to take up too much of the good people's time here.
Yeah, no, got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. But if you're having trouble with it, also feel free to reach out to me later, and if I have time, I'll take a look.
Okay, cool.
All right, cool. Laura, I saw you unmute yourself. Did you have a question?
Oh, no, I just said okay, thanks.
Oh, okay. Okay, any other questions? No? Are you feeling okay about API requests? I know it's a lot. You haven't officially learned this.
Yeah, great job, Henry. This is a deep dive, man.
Oh, thank you, Dan.
Yeah, I've just been listening and working on some updated sprint challenges. But yeah, this is good stuff, dude.
Fun. Thank you. Yeah. Well, hopefully this gives you enough information to make you dangerous. I kind of like this way of learning because this. I want to just take a second to do a self-important Henry speech, but about kind of the emotional experience of doing some of these things. Is that this week is going to feel hard emotionally because you're being stretched. You're asked to, you know, interact with APIs and state in ways that you haven't necessarily been prepared to. And that doesn't feel great. You feel like you're being pushed out of the nest too early. And in many ways you are. But this is a consequence-free environment. Yes, you do have to pass MVP for this week, but by and large, if you're committing every day, if you're writing components that interact with the API and use state, and you're applying the things that you've already learned and stretching yourselves into the thing you don't know, if your app is horrendously broken by the end of the week, in many ways that's okay, you know? Um, even with the sharpest team of developers, often the projects that were undertaken, either through our own eagerness on our planning at Friday to extend beyond MVP, or just the realities of developing this project, and the back-end person got delayed, so you couldn't do this until then, and it didn't really work, and it's okay. It's okay. The takeaway from this week is all about learning. So if it's stressing you out, take a step back, relax. This should be a positive experience in terms of your learning. And if it feels bad, that's okay. It isn't fun, to be asked to do these things that you don't know. But it's a really good learning experience. And how do you handle it when the requirements of a project are beyond what you're able to produce? This is a great experience to have that inside of an environment where your boss isn't going to come down on you and be like, you know, you didn't deliver. This is where you get to learn. You get to feel out like, oh, like how do I perform in these situations? Who do I need to ask for help? How could planning in the future be better with this? You know, so I know this is a lot, and I know you're being stretched really far, but in the next couple weeks, you're going to learn all of this. And I really like this style of learning where I kind of feel overextended. And then later I get to actually learn it because it gives me a really solid base for me to be like, oh, like I did all of these things wrong. This would be such a better way of doing it. And you get experience with it on your own. And I really enjoy that experience, and I hope you will too. Um, Thank you for listening to my little rant. But yeah, Build Week should be
Thank,
fun. The takeaway is
thank,
your knowledge.
yeah, thank you, Henry.
All right. Well,
Yeah, thanks, Henry.
thank you all so much for coming. I'll get this posted on YouTube and get the code posted as well. And I'll see you all later.